So when Wells imagines the future, what he's really doing is basing his. Are you listening? Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing The Time Machine, chapters 4 through 6. Normally, I record these lectures from my apartment in Brooklyn. However, I'm visiting my parents' home in northern New Jersey for a few days this week, so I'm recording the video from there. There won't be any difference between the usual videos and this one, except that a few times I might be joined by my parents' 1.5-year-old golden doodle, Max. So the time traveler arrives in the year 800,701 and meets human beings who are small and frail, who live in huge buildings that are falling apart, and who do not seem very intelligent, who almost seem like children. And what is his reaction? The question had come into my mind abruptly. Were these creatures fools? You may hardly understand how it took me. You see, I had always anticipated that the people of the year 800 and 2000 odd would be incredibly in front of us in knowledge, art, everything. Then one of them suddenly asked me a question that showed him to be on the intellectual level of one of our 5-year-old children. Asked me, in fact, if I had come from the sun in a thunderstorm. It let loose the judgment I had suspended upon their clothes, their frail light limbs, and fragile features. A flow of disappointment rushed across my mind. For a moment, I felt that I had built the time machine in vain. As we discussed in the previous video, the time traveler, who has the perspective of a late 19th century scientist and inventor, seems to have expected that future human beings would have continued to increase in scientific knowledge and have continued to develop technologies. But while that might have happened for a time, in the end, human beings became weak and feeble-minded. The time traveler's expectations of human beings have proven incorrect. Now, what's interesting about this novel is that we can consider two things at once: how the time traveler's profession and historical circumstances have influenced his expectations of the future, and also how H.G. Wells' historical circumstances influenced his expectations of the future, as they're portrayed in the future world of the book. Wells was brilliant, and as you can probably tell, very imaginative. But like his characters, and like everyone else in the world, his perspective was shaped and in some ways limited by his cultural and historical circumstances, by the ideas and ideologies and technologies he was familiar with as someone who lived in England in the late 19th century. The future portrayed in this book appears to be a future that H.G. Wells thought was possible. Why did H.G. Wells think the future might turn out this way? As the time traveler begins to figure out what has happened to human beings over the course of thousands of years, we begin to get a clearer sense of what H.G. Wells thought the future might be like and why he thought the future might be like this. Looking at the future human beings' huge buildings, luxurious clothes, and physical and mental weakness, the time traveler thinks, "It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity upon the wane. The ruddy sunset set me thinking of the sunset of mankind. For the first time I began to realize an odd consequence of the social effort in which we are at present engaged. And yet, come to think, it is a logical consequence enough. Strength is the outcome of need. Security sets a premium on feebleness. The work of ameliorating the conditions of life, the true civilizing process that makes life more and more secure, had gone steadily on to a climax. One triumph of a united humanity over nature had followed another. Things that are now mere dreams had become projects deliberately put in hand and carried forward. And the harvest was what I saw." Apparently, there was a period of time in history when some human beings lived lives of luxury and didn't have to work or worry about defending themselves. And as a result, over time, they gradually lost their physical strength and mental acuity. Why? Well, as Wells writes, strength is the outcome of need, security sets a premium on feebleness. Remember, Wells wrote this novel when the theory of evolution was still a major topic of debate, but Wells believed in it. He's assuming, following Darwin, that humans, like all other organisms, adapt from generation to their environments. If the environment does not call for strength or intelligence, human beings will lose those qualities over time. That's what Wells reasons. But of course, as you've discovered, Wells' future does not include only one human species. The time traveler glimpses, darting around the landscape at night, strange white, furry figures, like this. The time traveler figures out that man had not remained one species, but had differentiated into two distinct animals. That my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but that this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing which had flashed before me was also heir to all the ages. How did this happen? Proceeding from the problems of our own age, it seemed clear as daylight to me that the gradual widening of the present merely temporary and social difference between the capitalist and the laborer was the key to the whole position. No doubt it will seem grotesque enough to you, and wildly incredible, and yet even now there are existing circumstances to point that way. There is a tendency to utilize underground space for the less ornamental purposes of civilization. There is the Metropolitan Railway in London, for instance. There are new electric railways, there are subways, there are underground workrooms and restaurants, and they increase and multiply. Evidently, I thought, this tendency had increased till industry had gradually lost its birthright in the sky. I mean that it had gone deeper and deeper into larger and even larger underground factories, spending a still increasing amount of its time therein till, in the end, even now, does not an East End worker live in such artificial conditions as practically to be cut off from the natural surface of the earth? H.G. Wells lived in industrial England, where more and more people worked in difficult and dangerous conditions in factories or operating new technologies. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, he was a critic of capitalism and identified as a socialist. He saw, in his own time, the increasing exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, and he imagined this exploitation continuing for thousands of years. And he also, brilliantly I think, combined his social observations with the theory of evolution, conceiving of a human species that gradually evolved into two separate species because of economic conditions: the Eloi and the Morlocks. The time traveler, at this point in the book, expects of the Morlocks that such of them as were so constituted as to be miserable and rebellious would die, and in the end, the balance being permanent, the survivors would become as well adapted to the conditions of underground life and as happy in their way as the overworld people were to theirs. The time traveler theorizes that the Morlocks would have adapted to the conditions underground so completely as to feel content there. They would have evolved into beings that are happiest underground. Whether the time traveler is right about this, though, you'll have to read the rest of the book to find out. The time traveler is still figuring out the relationship between the Eloi and the Morlocks. I think it's also interesting to consider the relationship between the time traveler and these two species. The time traveler lives among the Eloi, but he doesn't feel exactly comfortable among them or even like them. Indeed, there was something in these pretty little people that inspired confidence. A graceful gentleness, a certain childlike ease. And besides, they looked so frail that I could fancy myself flinging the whole dozen of them about like ninepins. It's strange and a little disturbing, isn't it? That as he thinks the Eloi are gentle and childlike, he also thinks about flinging them around like bowling pins. He approaches the Eloi with a not very deeply buried defensiveness, even hostility. It's strange, too, how at the end of his first day, the dinner and my conversational beginnings ended, I noted for the first time that almost all those who had surrounded me at first were gone. It is odd, too, how speedily I came to disregard these little people. Already the time traveler is disregarding the Eloi, dismissing them as though they aren't really people. And as for the Morlocks, you can scarce imagine how nauseatingly inhuman they looked. Those pale, chinless faces and great, lidless, pinkish-gray eyes, as they stared in their blindness and bewilderment. The Morlocks physically repulse the time traveler, and yet both the Eloi and the Morlocks are the time traveler's descendants. They are part of the same biological lineage of humans. But one thing I think this book makes you wonder is, what is a human being? That question isn't easily answered. It depends at what time in history you mean. The human being as we understand it is really only a temporary transitional state. Humans evolved from earlier organisms and are evolving into other kinds of organisms. Like other species, the human species is slowly, but always, adapting to and changing in response to its changing environment. The time traveler's experience doesn't change only how he thinks about human beings in the future. Seeing the future seems to change as well how he thinks about human beings in the present, how he thinks about himself. In the future, the time traveler sometimes feels like a strange animal in an unknown world. Did you find any of that interesting?